Everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. Hope you are well. We're just waiting a minute quickly for everyone to join. In the meantime, please feel free to grab yourself a quick drink. But today we're going to talk about disallowed cost in practice and why issues persist despite open book policies. This is a webinar in collaboration with Built Intelligence and the CICES. So in this webinar, we will examine why transparency alone has not delivered the assurance or confidence many organizations expect, reframe disallowed cost not as a contractual technicality, but as a commercial risk and assurance issue, drawing on experience from complex infrastructure and energy programs, and what effective cost assurance looks like in practice. Today, we are joined by Cecelia Fadipe. Cecelia is a cost assurance and audit lead with extensive experience across major UK infrastructure and energy programs, including Network Rail, HS2, and Hinkley Point C. She specializes in open book target cost contracts, independent cost audits, risk reviews, and commercial assurance on complex, high-value projects. Her work focuses on strengthening commercial controls, improving cost transparency, and identifying systemic risk in challenging delivery environments. As chair of the multidisciplinary steering group for cost assurance, she has authored and led the publication of industry articles that are helping reshape standards and best practices across the industry. Before we jump into today's topic, please note that at the end we will have a short Q&A section. So please make sure to add any of your questions you might have into the chat. And those questions that we don't have time today for, we will answer later. Cecelia will send me the answers and they will be sent out to you. So any questions, anything, please feel free to add your questions into the chat. I can already see that somebody is asking for the slides. There will be a handout after the presentation. So look out for the email from us and you will also receive a certificate for your CPD hour. So welcome, Cecelia. Thank you for joining us today. A very interesting topic ahead of us. So should we just jump in?
Yes, Alex. Thank you so much for the intro. I'm delighted to be here today to present this webinar to the audience. Thank you, Alex. So without further ado, let's jump right in. I think we have a few polls.
Yes,
we have
absolutely.
Our first poll.
So let's start with the first poll. So the first poll is going to be, what is your biggest challenge with disallowed cost? So make sure to click the ones that you think are relevant to you and your organization, and feel free to add any of the other comments that might not be on the list, but you feel like that it is a kind of challenging for you. Right, should we just give another second for people and then we can have a look at the results and start from there? Oh, it looks like that half of the people already voted. Fantastic.
So let's give them a minute or so. Let's get everyone voting, because I want the polls to inform the discussions. Great.
We are at 65, going up, going up.
Okay.
Right, it looks like everybody who wanted to vote voted.
Yes.
Started to slow down. Right, should we end it?
Thank you.
Perfect. So here we go.
So thank you for that, Alex. So from the results of the poll, we can see that 31% believe it's the lack of supporting evidence and audit trail. That's the biggest challenge. We can see that the next one is inconsistent contract interpretation. And the next one after that is identifying disallowed costs early. So these are indicative, and they're what we generally see on the major program. So thank you to everyone who's voted. We will now dive back into the webinar and begin. Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to communicate to the audience is on this webinar is the importance of having an effective cost assurance framework. This is important for 4 reasons. 1, proactive risk management, continuous assurance, making sure that the roles on the program are defined and they're transparent, and also making sure that you have an independent assurance function that's there to support you. And with this, you can make sure that you have early reviews of the cost systems, making sure that they're aligned with the schedule of cost components and minimize any risk of disallowances. You can also identify exposure to risk or any cost escalations early on. And generally, commercial leadership have better information for decision making, and also you can be supported better by your finance teams and project teams with stronger controls and better outcomes. In addition to that, for continuous assurance, if this is embedded early enough, it becomes part of governance in the entire organization. And then this means that your stakeholders, the clients, the funders, they all have better certainty, and they can trust you better that you can actually deliver the program you've signed up to deliver as contractors, suppliers, or members of the supply chain. And this ongoing monitoring and testing just generally just gives confidence that things are on the right track. And communicating this is really important. So what I recommend is for client organizations, just call a meeting with your supply chain and communicate your cost assurance framework, communicate the strategy, so they know early on firsthand what you intend to do, and they can work alongside you to achieve those. And this has the impact of building a culture of assurance throughout the entire supply chain. There's accountability, there's transparency, and generally it drives improvement, not just in the client organization, but also in contractor, subcontractor, and supply chain organizations. And then when the roles are clearly defined and everyone knows who's doing what, they know who's part of the business as usual team, who's part of the day-to-day delivery team, who's your independent assurance provider, it just works better. So I would encourage communicating this and making sure that the roles are clearly set out, they're clearly communicated, defined, so that all the parties know who's doing what and who's responsible for every different aspect of the assurance framework. And on the independence challenge front, this is important because it allows you to have somebody who can look at the program with a fresh pair of eyes, who's not biased, who's not judgmental, and they can tell you where things are going wrong and early on, and you can make those decisions and communicate it back to your supply chain. So the importance of this framework is that it provides clarity, confidence, assurance to all the parties who are connected to yourselves on the program. Thank you, Alex. Next slide. So I know people are going to ask me, Cecelia, what about AI? Yes, AI is really important, especially in the current climate that we're in. You can use AI, you can use it for a number of things. And the things I advise to use it for is data analytics. You can use it to detect anomalies. You can use it for compliance detection, predictive assurance, and also you do need to have human intervention, human in the loop, and human judgment almost throughout all those 4 prior stages. And what does this do? By using AI for data analytics, you can analyze huge volumes of data very, very quickly, literally within minutes, seconds, across the entire organization, across a program, you can just tell what's going on. But, for me personally, I still prefer I use AI, for some of the analytics, but I do prefer to analyze things in multiple ways in my way. So again, in the way that I practice it, I would encourage you to have humans in the loop throughout the entire process. And for detecting anomalies or non-compliances, again, it can spot things that are unusual. any things that look out of the ordinary, AI can spot this very quickly. You can also ask it to sort of check multiple documentation for you, multiple folders, and ask it to detect compliance. So, you know, I have seen AI being used in remarkable ways, but it has to be used right. And you can also use it to predict what is likely to happen in future. But again, as I mentioned, you do need the human to check what AI is checking. You need a human checker to check everything at every stage to make sure that you're not making decisions with the wrong assumptions. Thank you, Alex. The next slide. The next framework I do recommend is 3 lines of defense. And what does this mean? It's a structured assurance model that ensures that you have assurance set across various stages and the various functions in the organization. The first one is operational reviews. These are business as usual, day-to-day reviews, cost control, timely checks and checking approvals, checking compliance with procedures, regulations, etc. It's the first line of defense and the first point of control that you can have within your organization. The second one is the second line of defense that I would recommend is commercial assurance. I have seen several organizations having, you know, commercial teams. Some of them are undertaking business as usual commercial reviews. Some of them have dedicated assurance functions who act as second line of defense, who are challenging, validating, and sort of driving improvements on cost and delivery across the entire program. And most importantly, you have independent assurance. You know, people like myself, you know, I can work on the client side, on the contractor side, subcontractor side, just providing an independent oversight, looking at things completely differently. And often this entails reviewing operational checks, reviewing commercial assurance, but also, most importantly, reviewing the contractors and the subcontractors to see whether they're complying with the requirements of the contract, whether they're complying with the schedule of cost components or any regulations. And the best way for this to work is when all 3 lines of defense are working together. And the impact is that it just strengthens governance, reduces the risk of disallowances, reduces disputes, and just makes things, you know, really clear early on, so that all the parties are aware that, you know, there is an assurance regime in place and they're working together in order to achieve this across the board. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Should we have the next poll, Cecelia?
I believe so. I believe so.
Perfect. Let's go for the second poll then. So let me just launch it quickly. So the next question would be, where does your greatest disallowed cost exposure rise? If you have any other, please specify in the comments, and then we're going to have a look at those as well. So just going to give you a minute or so. In the meantime, we already started getting a couple of questions, which we're going to have a look at the end of the session. Feel free to submit anything that you would like to ask in the chat.
Okay, so this webinar is designed to be interactive, so your poll responses are really important. It will drive the conversation.
It looked like we slowed down. Should we end the poll?
Absolutely.
And have a look at the results? Fantastic. So here we go. Let's have a look.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. So we can see from the results of the poll that labour and timesheet issues are one of the biggest drivers of disallowed costs exposure. The next one is plant and equipment utilization. And then we've got subcontractor costs, and then we've got smaller percentages around procurement compliance and others that, you know, we're encouraged to specify in the comments. So this is absolutely right. And you would actually see from the case studies that we're going to be looking at later on that, you know, your top 3 responses are exact case studies that I will be sort of sharing with yourselves during the course of this webinar. So thank you so much for your responses there. And this is absolutely what we see is indicative of, you know, the sort of exposure that I find when I'm auditing on programs. So thank you for those inputs. Thank you, Alex.
One of the other what we saw, I can see in the comments, some people shall mentioned accruals, some contract accruals.
Yes,
Yes.
that's true. And accruals could cross any of those, defined cost areas. It could cut across labor, it could be plant, it could be subcontract accruals, it could be overhead accruals. So if they're not supported by records, then again, they will be a source of disallowances. Thank you, Alex. So in this section, we're going to be looking at the intention of the NEC philosophy, the defined cost principles, and what the schedule of cost components are designed to do. So the NEC contract is designed to be collaborative. It emphasizes mutual collaboration, trust, transparency, and also encourages proactive risk management and contract management in order to promote effective project delivery. And what we find is that when these principles are not being adhered to properly, that's when the issues arise. So what is the defined cost concept? So this concept represents when costs that are recoverable by the contractor or the suppliers, subject to compliance with contract terms and proper documentation records and defined cost principles. The schedule of cost components, the structured list of costs that are allowable, and they include subcontract costs, labor costs, plant and equipment, and also charges. So these are clearly set out in the different forms of contracts. And typically we would find disallowances in the cost-based contract. So these are the NEC option C, option D, and option E contracts. So they're the ones that usually have audit clauses that are linked to them, and they require a lot of demonstration of records. We'll go through that later on. And the final point there is around risk and compliance management. So again, I would recommend, just having a risk register, making sure that you're proactive with your risk, your early warnings. Don't say that because the client has not asked for it, we don't need it. If the contract says it's required, please be proactive and make sure you have this in place. That is the whole philosophy and intention behind what the NEC wants us to do on this cost type contracts. So understanding these principles, understanding what the defined cost means, and the what's allowed from the schedule of cost components is really important in creating an environment of transparency, compliance, and making sure we drive value for money on the programs. Thank you, Alex. Okay. So the key causes that drive this, the first one is around defined costs. They are costs that are allowable costs in the contract, and it includes amounts that should be paid less disallowed costs. And the disallowed costs are any costs that are not supported. They are defects related costs due to quality issues, non-compliance issues, or contractor failures or contractor risks that sit with the contractor. So it's really important to understand and that everybody owns their risk as intended by the contract forms. So with the option C and option D contracts, the risks are supposed to be shared between client and the contractor. And then with option E, which is cost reimbursable, typically the risk sits on the client side, but they also want you to make sure that you can demonstrate all of the costs that you're applying for. So ultimately, the clients do not want to pay more than they should be paying, for delivery. So the onus is on yourselves, being contractors, subcontractors, supply chain, to demonstrate this cost and to be able to back it with records and accounts that you are entitled to those. And that takes me to clause 52, which is the records, accounts, making sure your forecasts are accurate and they're backed up and they can be evidenced, with an audit trail. If there's no evidence, that's criteria for weak entitlement and no recoverability of the cost. So I would recommend, making sure that you have those in place. If you don't know how to do those, you can always sort of research, you can get in touch with people who have the expertise that can help you to make sure that you have this in place. So that by the time your clients send an independent auditor like myself to your organization, you have this in place and they have confidence that you can deliver and you can comply with the principles of the NEC contracts. Clause 53 focuses on disallowed costs, and what this does, nobody likes disallowed costs because it ultimately reduces your potential revenue, your profit, and the amounts that you can get paid in terms of cash flow as contractors. So nobody likes this. But on the other side, the clients themselves, they do not want to pay more than they're supposed to pay. So if everybody sort of abides by the principles of the contract and they don't try to transfer risk to each other, then it should work well in principle. But that doesn't happen, and that's why we have these issues. When somebody tries to transfer risk, either client tries to transfer risk or contractor tries to transfer risk to the client, then we have the issues, we have the disputes. That's what usually causes it. But if everyone abides by the principles, then we shouldn't have any problems in theory. But this is not a theoretical world. This is a practical world, and we're all people. So I would say just making sure that you have the right people with the right behaviors who understand how this contract is supposed to be used and who use it with the best intentions. That is what is recommended here. In terms of the schedule of cost components, we're looking at costs related to people, costs related to equipment, plant, materials, subcontractors, and charges. And what I would recommend here is making sure that the architecture of your financial system is aligned to this. Obviously, we all work across different sectors, there are different multiple clients. You might not be able to align it specifically to one client type or one sector type. Well, if you can't do that, you have to make sure that you have the due diligence in place to map it back to each client requirement. Otherwise, you will have disallowed costs. Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. So what is the cost recovery decision tree? Decision tree is a 5-step process that tells you what you need to do in order to determine whether a cost is recoverable or not. The first test is the cost being incurred? Is there sufficient evidence to back the cost? Is it aligned with the requirements of the schedule of cost components? Is it contractually compliant, and is it actually recoverable? And what do this mean? Has the cost been incurred by the contractor, and is it valid? Is there sufficient evidence to back up the cost that you want to claim? And are you including this as part of your application for payment? I would recommend doing this. It's upfront heavy work, but it's better to do this. And by doing this, you provide confidence that you actually know what you're doing, and you have records. Don't wait for the client to ask for records to back up your cost. Just provide it so that they get used to knowing that actually this particular supplier, this contractor, they're much more advanced in their cost assurance journey, and they're a bit more proactive. And of course, needless to say, it must be aligned with the requirements of the schedule of cost components and the categories there. And you can't claim twice. You can't claim in as defined cost, and you can't also claim as part of the fee. You can only claim it once. And also making sure that it's not a disallowable cost, or it's not a risk that sits with you as contractors that you're trying to pass on, because the client will know this. And once they believe that you're not you don't have their best interest at heart, then the regime will be a bit stricter on yourself. And of course, make sure it's reasonably incurred and that the amount is in line with the contract intention. Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. We're now going to what constitutes disallowed cost in practice. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we have our next poll now.
Yes, we do. Let me just pull up the next one. So here we go. Would you allow or disallow these costs? Please make sure that you click those which you would disallow. So there's a couple that you can see on the screen. If there's any further that you would like to add, please make sure to add it to the chat. And then we're going to have a look at the results and see how you guys are doing.
This is actually a very interesting question. And depending on where you sit, Alex, you would disallow this. And if you're if you're on the subcontractor side and someone has done any of this, you will disallow it. And if you're on the client side or the contractor side, you would equally disallow it. So it's really, really interesting to see how this is playing out, but waiting to see the final result.
So we are about halfway through the
Right.
voting. So let's have a look. It looks like we started to slow down. Interesting results,
Really
let me
interesting.
tell you.
Great.
So it looks like that anyone who wanted voted.
I agree,
Yeah,
Alex.
let's just have a look. So here we go.
Thank you. So really, really interesting result here. So without, question, duplicate resource allocation is the number one criteria for disallowances. And followed closely by that, we've got unsupported timesheets. So you can see both of those relate to labor type costs. And again, as mentioned in the prior polls, that is where we see the biggest disallowances when it comes to people costs. Obviously, it's also the area where, we have the biggest amount of costs. So it's not unusual that that's where we also have the biggest risk as well. So I would recommend focusing on this area, making sure that your teams are well set up to provide records to back this up in order to limit and minimize disallowances. And if you have a regime where you're self-disallowing this before the client representative comes in to disallow it, then you're providing more confidence to them. Almost sort of sense checking and self-checking yourself before you do get audited is good practice. And the next one to this is rework from defects. So again, just making sure that you have a good quality management regime in place, because ultimately if risk sits with you for correcting your defects, the client will not want to pay for it, and rightfully so. And of course, followed closely by that is idle plant for utilization. So similarly, the client, like labor, the client wants to know what work has been undertaken or what service has been undertaken by the resource. So similarly, they want to know what you've been using the plant for. Especially if you're an organization that supplies the plant and the machinery, you don't just want to be charging the client just to have the plant on their site. They want to know what it's being utilized for, and that it is driving value and it is being used to provide for the works and to deliver the works, and not just standing idly on site. And the final one is around procurement issues. Again, just making sure that you have you're complying with the policy as agreed in the contract or the framework, and that you're self-checking those procurement requirements, and you're driving best value for money for the client. The client expects this from yourselves. If they've contracted a huge sum of the delivery to you, they expect you to be proactive in driving value for money for them through your procurement activities. Thank you, Alex.
Somebody mentioned in the comments that for defects, it depends on the defect liability period. Anything
Yeah.
you would like to? Yeah, perfect. So let me
Yes.
just close this poll.
Thank you.
And then here we go.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So we're not going to sort of dive into some further case studies of what constitutes disallowed cost in practice and the interpretation of disallowed costs, and how they come about, some of the common triggers and system issues, and also effective contract management in minimizing this. So typically any costs that are incurred that cannot be supported by records and accounts, or they're non-compliant, or they've been known to be delivered inefficiently, can be disallowed costs under the NEC contract forms. So that is the number one issue. Another common trigger is where you have incorrect labor cost for people. Maybe they're not approved, or maybe it's the wrong rates being used, or the wrong hours, or the overtime is not being approved properly, or any costs that relates to people, and that includes allocated costs as well for those people. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of timesheets, because the timesheets are not just recording the time for labor, and this includes staff, labor, any other contingent labor resources as well. It's also used, the time allocation is also used as a driver to allocate costs, whether it's other charges that are allocated, that defined costs, but they're not direct costs, they're indirect costs that can be allocated. Time is often used as a cost driver to allocate those. So if that's wrong, then it's very likely that those allocations will be wrong as well. So just getting that right is of utmost importance. Thank you, Alex. Okay. And why does disallowed cost remains a persistent issue despite open book principles and the need for transparency and working collaboratively? I mentioned it at the beginning. It's because we're looking at things from different lenses. We're looking at the clients looking at things from their lens. They obviously they believe they've contracted at a certain rate and they want to make sure that they deliver as close to that as possible. Obviously, there will be change, there'll be compensation, but they want to make sure that's backed by accurate estimates, accurate forecasts, and that it's backed up by records that they're happy with. So again, I would say making sure that you have the right controls, the right processes, that people working within your commercial, finance, and project teams, they know how to use these controls consistently, and that is communicated across the board, whether you do this via training or best practice lessons learned. You just find a way to communicate so that you're not exposing yourself to the risk of disallowances. So if those upstream controls are not in place, then it's a big risk. And also making assurance retrospective, making transparency retrospective is an issue. And that way you're not providing upfront assurance to your funders or your clients that you've got the right controls and the right assurance regime in place. So from the beginning, they just don't trust what you're doing. And if that happens, you will be hit with audit after audit and also review after review, because they don't have that confidence in what you're doing. So being proactive, don't be retrospective about it. And of course, making sure that, when you have this frameworks in place for assurance, make sure that it is being governed properly. You have the right commercial leadership in place. So when I undertake this audit, it's really important to me to make sure that I work closely with commercial leadership. I feedback what I'm finding and I feed it back to both organizations as best as I can, and making sure that from the very beginning, everyone knows what is going to happen, and that if you don't comply, the requirements of the contract will be administered. So you will have disallowances, or you will have demand for more records, and you would have, non-compliances that need to be rectified. So again, it's symptomatic of this upstream, weaknesses and controls, whether it's people controls, system controls, or any other form of controls, process controls. That is what causes this. Thank you, Alex. Next slide. So we've touched on some of this in the past. So here I've got 4 root causes of disallowances and assurance failures. So the first one is a weakness in your cost system. So when I say cost systems, it's any system at all that captures costs or any drivers of costs. So whether it's your timesheet system, whether it's your mileage and expenses system, whether it's your financial system, whether it's your fleet system, any system that has the opportunity to capture cost, capture data, and be used to allocate cost back across the contract is a cost system. So just making sure that the data quality there is consistent, is accurate, and just provides confidence is really important. So the timeliness of assurance is key, just making sure it's front-loaded rather than doing it retrospectively or at the back, so that from the beginning your supply chain know that this is a commercial leadership regime that will sort of administer the requirements of the contract. They would invoke the audit clause, they will ask for records and accounts, they will ask for this to be checked, they will make sure that they're driving value for money for government, because a lot of this projects sometimes are government funded, sometimes they're privately funded, sometimes the mix of those. So they do have an obligation to make sure that they drive value. So they want to make sure that these behaviors are in place, and to make sure that they have certainty that you are driving the best value for them. And in doing so, you just minimize conflict, you minimize disputes, and you just build trust that you are delivering this as best as possible for your clients. So again, transparency alone is not the only issue, just making sure that you have the right controls in place. This is really, really important. Controls that, practices that you have in place across people, process and systems to make sure that there are checks and balances along the line to make sure that you can comply with the requirements of the contract, you can comply with regulations that are required in your industry, you can comply with the defined cost principles and the schedule of cost components requirements. And of course, you also have to make sure that you have the right people in place. So often, the contract intentions are clear, but usually it is the people that administer the contracts, people that are working, in the delivery side of things, operations. If they have the wrong behaviors, whether it's client side or contractor side, then there will be issues, there will be failures. So this whole principle of governance assurance, it cuts across people, cuts across controls and systems. Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this next section, we're going to go through some case studies. Alex, are we ready for the next poll or not yet?
No, absolutely we are. Let me just show the last poll before we dive into the case studies. Here we go. So where does most disallowed cost risk arise in your organization? If you have anything in the other section, please make sure to add it to the chat. And let's have a look. Okay, we are about halfway through.
Okay. Okay, I think I'll just start. Yeah.
Perfect. So here we go.
Thank you, Alex. So we've got poor quality records and evidence as the biggest driver of disallowed cost risk within organizations. Actually, that's majority of the issues. And then the next to that is insufficient contract knowledge. And following that, the third one is weak controls and governance. So what I would say there is there are a few things that you can do, in order to minimize these issues. You could sort of agree upfront with the client organization what adequate records and account means for them. And if you do that, from the onset, you already know what the benchmark is, and you can sort of set yourselves up in order to deliver to that. So the come audit, you already have those audit trails in place. And then when it comes to the insufficient contract knowledge, there's so many things you can do. You can sort of organize training sessions if you want to do that within your organizations. If you want, it to be undertaken by somebody like myself, that can be organized for you. If you want to share best practice, lessons learned, again, that can be done. Our steering group, we do share lots and lots of best practice, around, good practice and what, good contract management looks like. So you can access those things and sort of strengthen your controls and governance. Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please.
Here we go.
So in this section of the webinar, we're going to go through a few case studies and going to then deep dive into one or two of those. So the first one is around 2 million being reviewed as part of labor cost, and because it was unsupported by timesheets, there were also evidence of duplicate charging. A challenge was raised and there was risk of disallowances. The second one relates to agency labor markup, again not being supported by contract requirements. So it was, within the contract there was no opportunity for you to charge a markup, but then this markup was passed on to the client. So again, the recoverability of that was challenged by the client. Again, that's another risk of disallowances. The third one relates to supervisor management resources being charged across multiple projects simultaneously. But this is where, we have one contractor organization working across multiple projects for the same organizations. Well, of course, you're going to have cross-checking sometimes, and this was spotted. So again, this was challenged, and as risk of huge disallowances around labour costs. And finally, head office costs incorrectly allocated to project defined costs. So typically head office cost that is not defined cost is supposed to be recovered in the fee, and it should not be recovered within defined costs. If this happens, it will be disallowed. We're going to move on to the next slide now. Thank you, Alex. So here we deep dive on the labour case study. So the issue was that the timesheets were not supported. There was duplication of cost allocations, and that led to the challenge being raised. So what do I recommend here? Make sure that your timesheets are in place, they're adequately approved, any overtime is approved, any extra bonuses for out of office hours is transparently declared, and the client effectively knows what they're going to get, because very, very quickly labor costs can double. If somebody's charging overtime and they're working more overtime than their actual hours, before a program that was supposed to cost £5 billion is costing £10 billion. So it's really, really important to be really proactive when it comes to labor costs, and to make sure that you provide the evidence required, you validate any submissions in your application for payment, and if there's any fluctuations in month, you just be upfront and discuss it with the client before they actually come and challenge this. And this way they have confidence that you're providing a certain level of independent oversight, a certain level of cross-checking and sense checking yourselves before they come and send out an independent auditor to, like myself, to audit and review your costs. Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. So in this case study group, we're going to look at defects, plants, subcontractors. So for plants, the key thing is making sure you're only charging for plant and machinery when it is being used to deliver the works. Idle time will not typically be liable, will be challenged and recorded as downtime and not recoverable. Similarly, if this is subcontracted out, make sure that there's evidence to make sure that this has been done competitively, especially if you're subcontracting within your group organization. You have to make sure that that value for money test has been demonstrated upfront to the client, so that they know that you're not just there to sort of charge them in an unreasonable manner. And of course, defects, somebody raised the question earlier, defects must be within the defects period. Outside of that, it becomes disallowable. So making sure that you have the right quality checks in place for removal, reinstalling and retesting, and making sure you're assessing this before the defects liability period expires and it becomes unrecoverable and becomes a disallowed cost. Thank you, Alex. And we're going to deep dive into the plant case study here. So this is around 24/7 charging for plant. This could be plant, it could be machinery, it could be fleet. If it's not being used to deliver the work or for the service, then it is at risk of being disallowed. So you want to make sure that you sense check the hours being claimed versus the hours being used at site. You want to make sure that you have site records as evidence to make sure that you have the right data to support your cost being applied for in the application for payment. The cost needs to be reasonable. So just treat it as though if it was somebody building your extension for you, would you be happy with that? Would you say that's reasonable? And make sure that in this case they were charging for 480 hours per week, but actual utilization was about half of that. So the risk is that 50% of that is likely to be disallowed, so that you've been overcharging and trying to over recover costs for plant that's not been fully utilized at site. So that's something I would not recommend. So try and make sure that you're only charging for actual usage and you can drive the right cost recovery. In here, I've got further examples of labour cost inconsistency, examples on live programs that I see day in, day out. And this is from audits. I've undertaken probably about 100 to date, and it's counting. So labour is always the number one, making sure you have the right records, that they're approved records, and they're backed up by what they're doing. You can link it back to the work that they're doing in the work breakdown structure, what element of projects that they're delivering, and they're not being double booked, double charged. Is really important. And the next one is around defects work, rework. We've covered that in the previous slides, but that sort of goes a little bit further there, making sure that it's not disallowed and does not create commercial risk for your organization. Just making sure that you have a tight quality management process in place to sort of check this and make sure that any defects are rectified within the liability period. And plant we've just covered in detail, but there are further details there. So the key lesson there is utilization evidence is important, not just for people costs, but also for plant, machinery, fleet as well, and being transparent around this. And the fourth thing is around making sure that you have the right system controls in place early on. The lessons learned, from the programs I've worked in is early identification of disallowances. So just do this yourself so that the client organization can see that you have the controls in place, and it gives them confidence. It gives them, assurance that you are being transparent and you're being proactive. And it just minimizes conflict, minimizes disputes and any further escalations. Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. So here I just leave you with further more common audit findings from some of the work I've done. So cost mismatches, that it's one that we have not mentioned, unapproved markup, and this could be typically it's labor, it could be other areas as well. I've seen it in IT costs, especially I've seen it in plants and fleet. So just make sure that those sort of things are either being agreed upfront within the contract, or you just don't try and pass it on to the client. Because once they sense that you're trying to transfer risk onto them, the behaviors will change. And when the behavior of the client changes, then the behavior of the contractor changes, and then we have an environment of conflict and there's disputes. So that's how things go wrong. We've touched on disputes and correcting things within the liability period. We've talked about idle plant, making sure you have utilization records and data, recording to downtime and not trying to pass that on, because that's value leakage for the client and the funders. They don't want that. When it comes to procurement, especially when you're contracting, subcontracting within your group, make sure you're transparent about this. Make sure that if you subcontracting externally, make sure that the terms flow or the controls flow through, and you are evidencing that value for money down the supply chain. And of course, when it comes to the controls and audit regimes, using the 3 lines of defense, make sure that you're proactive with this, you're being transparent, and you have the records and controls in place, and you're minimizing the risk of duplicate charging. Once the client senses that that is happening, then they will just not have the trust and confidence in what you're doing. The next slide, please. Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've now sort of almost come to the end of the webinar. I'm going to leave some time for Q&A. I leave you with 5 takeaways for leadership on your programs. The first one is around early assurance. Make sure you have the regime in place. You communicate this to your supply chain. If you don't know how to do this, you can reach out to me, reach out to people who have the expertise that can help you to do so. You make sure that you have records across all the different spheres of defined cost categories, and also in line with those schedule of cost components. Make sure that this records, there's a complete audit trail. I would recommend a 3-way check of data records that you can use to support the cost that you're passing through. Compliance, do adhere to the requirements of the contract. If contract requires you communicate using a contract management system, please do so. Don't communicate things by email. If it requires risk management, early warning principles, please be really, really strict with this, and challenge early. If you believe that the client organization is sort of doing things wrong, challenge. If they've communicated a regime that they're not complying with, challenge it. And just promote transparency to build trust. And when applied properly, these principles will have the overarching effect of strong governance, strong assurance, transparency, collaboration as intended by the NEC form contracts, and ultimately better delivery and better value outcomes for all the parties involved. Thank you. Next slide, please.
So these are the polls that we went through today.
Yes.
So thank you so much for everyone participating. And let's go for the questions. So I saw a couple in the chat that I found interesting. One of them was that, do you think that contract management systems like CIMA, FastDraft, or CyPro are essential for to maintain audit trails and helping to demonstrate compliance with evidence-defined costs for audit purposes? And have you experienced with audit that the records will explore and look into? Further, does having a downstream subcontract management system like CIMA helps maintain upstream and downstream compliance? What is your experience with this, Cecelia?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the audience who's put the question in. So, as you know, on the programs that we deliver, they're usually backed up by strong GDPR rules and strong requirements of the contract, and one of this is audit rights. So, and with this audit rights, it means the client has access to all records and accounts. And that includes, records within your contract management system, whether it's your estimates, your approvals, your early warning notices, your risk registers. Absolutely, they do give me access to the systems, and they ask me to check them, to check samples to see whether it's been complied with. And I have seen examples of when it's been done properly and when it's not been properly. Personally, I would recommend that they are really beneficial, and I would encourage that you do so. I have seen client organizations that are actually providing the system throughout the supply chain because they want it, they want it used. And as you know, a lot of the projects we deliver, the huge sums of money, very, very complex programs, lots and lots of records. So it's really, really difficult to manage this with Excel spreadsheets or, in somebody else's folders. So I have seen really, really good best practice with communicating through the contract management system, having records, having audit trails through the systems, and it does work well. So absolutely, I would recommend that.
Perfect, thank you. The next question would it be normal to agree what would be used as evidence for cost audits ahead of time so systems can be set up to capture this? Most of our disputes arise from auditors not accepting significant weight of evidence as their driver seems to be to hit a target disallowed amount.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And those are some of the behaviors that we try to address on our steering group. We do not want auditors sort of exhibiting these behaviors. I have, been involved in an audit before when somebody tried to disallow, like 80% of the cost. You can't do that. So, there are guiding principles as to how things should be done properly. So what I would recommend is if you're on one of this cost-based contracts, be upfront, ask the client to say, can I see your cost assurance framework? Can I understand what is going to be deemed as appropriate records and accounts? Can I can you tell us, can you run a session for us? And, you might need to incur some spend, in order to prevent future disallowances. And I have seen this being done. So upfront, agree what, the right audit trails, what it means for the client. And if you can do that before the auditors come, you already have this in place. And I have seen examples where, a certain client, they knew they were going to be audited because they just signed this contract, one of the major programs currently going on. And they said, look, we know this is coming, and they've told us they're going to audit us every, I don't know whether it was every 12 weeks or every 6 weeks, something like that. We need to know that we have the right things in place. So that way you sort of get things in line before the audit starts. You make sure that you have your 3-way checks for all the different cost categories. Just make sure you have 3 different pieces of evidence, and you can even test this with the client. Does this satisfy you? And don't try and be non-transparent about it, because the client will sense this. When you're trying to hide things, they know this, and they can it just don't, it just puts their back up against the wall, and it just gives them that distrust, that look that you're hiding something. Just be upfront and ask them, what would you like to see? Does this satisfy your requirements? And in doing so, you will save yourself a whole load of disallowances and disputes.
In line with transparency, somebody asked, how do you balance transparency and sharing the data with GDPR? Obviously, this is a big thing, and companies don't want to be in a position when they are breaking the rules. What would you tell them as an advice on this topic?
Yeah, so again, another really important question. So as I mentioned earlier, we have strict GDPR rules within this contract. We have confidentiality rules. There's commercially sensitive information. For me as an auditor, I have to sign NDAs most of the time. And a lot of the time, I can't even share my working papers. I can share the outcome of what I find with the client, but I can't share what I have been provided in full with the client. And what this does is it provides confidence to the contractor that, look, they've got somebody here who protects their interest in a way. They're just checking to see whether we've done things properly. So what I would recommend you do is that separation. And that's why, at the beginning, I started with the 3 lines of defense. There are certain confidential records that the contractor organizations or subcontractors are not happy to share with the client organization. And this is fine, and this is what I see most of the time. So as long as this is communicated upfront, and the auditor and the client says, okay, yeah, we might, and the client says, yes, we recognize that we might not have full access to this, but we want our auditors to have access to the full records and accounts. We want them to be able to provide us that with the findings backed up by evidence that they have seen. And typically that's what I do on behalf of the clients I work for.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cecelia. I think that's kind of the time that we had for today. All of the rest of the questions will be answered later. And if we just go to the next slide, this webinar has been brought to you in collaboration with Built Intelligence and CICES. So don't forget to visit the CICES website, where you can read about their courses, memberships and committees, such as the Women's Network, which I think, Cecelia, you're the part of as well, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So I work very closely with the CICS, and also our steering group works very, very closely with the CICS. So if you are not aware of our steering group outputs, I would ask Alex to kindly share this with yourselves. So if your organization wants to be involved in our steering group, again, just reach out to me. My contact details are on the slides as well. Connect to me on LinkedIn and reach out to me. Always happy to help.
Absolutely. So that's where, so they can find you on LinkedIn, and I think that if they scan the QR code, it's straight away links our listeners to your LinkedIn page. So make sure that you connect with Cecelia. And if you are interested in our products and Built Intelligence, we do have our fast draft system, which somebody actually mentioned in the comments, which is our contract management software. If you're interested, go to a website, you can book a demo. We also have our academy, our e-learning platform, where you have access to over 1,000 courses on contract management, construction law, the different types of contracts such as NEC, JCT or FIDIC, and much more. So feel free to go onto the website and have a look. And if you have any questions related to contracts that you might be stuck on, join our community. Reachback is our community site, where it's a free site where you can ask questions related to your contracts, issues that you might come across. We have a panel of experts who are answering these questions, as well as our community members. And if you come across any question that you might know the answer to, please feel free to reply to that. We love to see the interactions between our members. So visit the sites, and if you have any questions, let us know. And thank you so much for Cecelia for today's session. Some great insight and amazing conversation on Disallowed Cost. And I'm thanking all of you as well for attending. Hope you enjoyed today's session. and we are looking forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you. Have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone. Bye.